Back again, and welcome back to the follow-on video from what we did in our last video where we built our login page. In this video, we're going to actually write the logic or the code behind the login process, so you guys can see the different method that we're using to create our login page. So without further ado, I'm going to jump straight into it. You can see on my screen where we've left off. We've got the login page that I've created. We click on the login button. We're hitting that that login action route. So now we're going to go ahead and we're going to implement the code that's going to allow us to log in with actual credentials that we've got stored in our dummy database. So to do that, I'm going to go back to my app directory, and I'm going to go into the controllers and get my security controller back up, and I'm going to start implementing the method and the code that is needed. But before we do that, there's a couple of dependencies that I need to bring in, and the one that I need to bring in right away within my container method is the Authenticator class. So I'm going to bring that in. I'm going to give it a key of Authenticator, same as the class name. Not necessary, but that's what I'm going to call it. Right, so let's do that. Authenticator, and that is located within the core directory. So it's going to be magma core auth, and it's going to be Authenticator ::: class, just like so. And this is going to give us this class actually contains one method called authenticate, and what it does, it takes in the password and the email address from our login form, check that it's valid, and return the actual object for that user which matches those credentials. So back down into our login action, let's get rid of this. And the first thing I actually want to do, I actually want to create a private method outside of this method that's going to do the authentication. So I'm going to say private function, and I'm going to call it get auth user. Let's spell that properly. Get auth user. And this is going to return an object, right? So what I'm going to do, I'm going to also use some objects that we've already got declared within the base controller class, which is the request object that we did in a past video where we did a wrapper class around the Symfony HTTP foundation. We're going to actually get that request object to fetch the data from our login inputs. So I'm going to store it within a variable called user to say equal this request, and how I wrap these and the way that I have wrapped these objects is I wrapped it in a method called handler. So we need to get that method handler, then we can fetch some of that Symfony method that comes with that request object, and the one that we're going to use is get. But before that, actually we need to actually wrap all of this within our authenticate method from our authenticator object. So I should say this authenticator, and we want to call the authenticate method like so. So this method takes in 3 arguments. It takes in the user email, the user password, and it takes in an optional object, which is the current object that we're working. We could pass that in, or we could omit it completely, but I'm going to pass all 3 arguments in on separate lines. So I'm going to say this request handler, and I want to get the email, like so. Second argument is the password, which is going to be the same, to be this request handler get password hash, just like so. And the third argument, I'm just going to do this, just pass that entire object in, just like that. Now I'm just going to return the user, just like so, right? So I'm going to back up into our login method, and I'm going to start writing in some conditional checks that we're going to use to actually make sure that the form that we're clicking is being submitted from our actual script. So I'm going to use a next property that we've already declared within our base controller file, and it's our form builder component. And within that component, we've got a couple of methods that's going to help us check these things. So first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to say if it this form builder, just like so. Then you notice that I've done the 2 colons at the end, and then end if. That's just one, well, that's just another way of actually writing PHP scripts. I could put a curly bracket and end it with a curly bracket, but this is also a valid way of doing it. So I'm going to say if this form builder, and the method I want to call is can handle requests. This takes one optional argument, which is that request object again, but I'm going to omit this from this particular method because I don't really need it, right? So I'm saying if this form builder can handle the current request, and this form builder is submittable. Right, now this takes one argument, and it's an important argument, and the argument it's going to take is a string, and it's going to call sign in. Now I'm going to show you where it's important that we when we create our forms, let's bring that form back up again so I can show you what I'm saying. So when we create that form in the last video, we give a sign in name to our name attribute on our submit type. Now the attribute value, or the value of name sign in, has to match what we pass back to that is submittable method. If you don't, your form will not be submitted, it will not work, right? So that's important, has to match the name of our submit button, right? So we say if this form builder can handle the current request and the form is submittable, then we want to say if this form builder again, right, CSRF validate, then we're good to go. So we're saying if the CSRF tokens that I have showed you within the source code in the last video, if those validate, then and only then are we good to process this login form. So I'm going to do a var dump, or just say die, and we're going to say working. Save that. We're going to come and refresh our page. We get in an error saying this authenticator does not exist, so I might have called that incorrectly. So yeah, I got a misspelling right there. Take that off. Reload the page. That error is gone, and let's click on the login button and see what happens. Now that works. So we've passed all the steps from the request to is submittable to our validation of our CSRF tokens. So now we're hitting that die function, which is killing the script and outputting a message. So we know that when we hit that submit button, it's all working up to this point, right? So now we're going to actually implement some other external method that's going to help us process that login form. So I'm going to actually delete this function right here, and the next thing we need to do is we need to use that private method that we created at the start of the video called the getAuth user. So I'm going to say if this get authenticated user, then we want to do something. So what we're saying is, if the information that we submitted from our form, if that was valid, then and only then we want to return that user object. So I want to actually go ahead and also implement a second private method, which is going to sit exactly where my cursor is, and it's going to do some other bits with that user object. So I'm going to create another method. It's called private function, and I'm going to call this get login, and I'm going to use another core or another Magma core component, which is going to help us to get the login method, and we're going to pass the relevant arguments to it. So, and these are static methods. I'm going to refer to the class as authorize. That's what the class is called, authorize. And within that, I want the get login method, or login method actually, like so. And this method takes two arguments. It takes that user object, plus it takes the value from our checkbox. If I go back, it takes the value from this checkbox. So we're going to pass those two arguments in, or we're going to define them within this method and then pass them in. So the first is going to be an object, which is going to be that authenticated user. Just going to just say auth user, and the second is just going to be remember me, because that is the value, or that is the attribute name for that checkbox. It's called remember me. I'm just going to pass it in to that login method from that authorized class. It's to be auth user and remember me. And all this is doing is it's starting our session, and if that button or if that checkbox is ticked, we're going to do some other processing, like we're going to store a token within our database, and we're going to store a cookie within the user browser only if that checkbox is clicked. If that checkbox is not clicked, then the only thing that's going to happen within this particular method is that we're going to be starting our session and assigning user ID to the actual object ID of that particular user. So back up into our login action, I'm going to say this get login, and I'm going to pass in this get auth user method in, and I'm going to also create a next private function, and I'm going to do something similar to what I've done right here. So I'm going to say private function get remembering, or just say is remembering login. And again, we're going to get that request object and fetch the value from that checkbox. So to store it into a variable called remember me, and it's going to be this request handler, and we want to get the attribute remember me, because that is what we called it. If we look at the source, that is what we've called this particular. Let's reload our page. Getting a syntax error, yep. And let's say if remember me return remember me, like that. let's reload, look at our source, get our form. You can see that's what we've called it, remember me, right? So we need to pass in that name attribute in that get method to return whatever value if we click the checkbox or not. And we're going to pass this method as the second argument within this get login method. So it's going to be this is remember and login, just like so. So the next bit that I want to do is when we log in successfully, I want to display a message, and I also want to redirect back to our home page for the time being. So again, that's pretty easy because we've done all the hard work, especially within that base controller class. So we can do stuff like this. Flash message. We're going to pass in a message as the first argument, say login successfully, and by default the second argument will always be a success type, right? So if this was going to be a different kind of message, then we will use the second argument to say if it's going to be an info message or a warning or an error. But for this particular message, it's going to be a success message, and the second argument already default to success, so we're going to completely omit that second argument. And the next thing I want to do is say this redirect, and I want to redirect back to the home page, and I'm going to put a / that's going to denote our home page, just like so. I mean, there's other bits that we can do, like we can do error checking or say else. If this doesn't happen, do that instead. But this is going to be a very small example. I'm going to see if it's going to work, right? So if I reload the page, click login, right, so that don't work. So what we're getting, invalid user credential, and that is coming from our authenticated or authenticator class, saying that these values that we put into our input does not validate to a user. And I've done that on purpose because there's a next step that we want to actually do for this to work, and I have omitted that so I can actually go through it and show you what's going on. So if I click it again, what's happening? It says invalid user credential, which means nothing in our database matches. Now I know that these data that I've got in the input field, I know that they're correct because I have got a user in a database with these exact credentials. So why is it not working? Well, there's a next step that we need to take as well, and that's to do with our model, because at the moment we're logging in, but we're not logging into any database. We're not logging into any database table because we don't know, or the login script does not know what it's logging into. So I'm going to set that up, and it's dead simple, and it's a matter of creating a new folder within our app directory called model. So I'm going to create a new directory called model, and I'm going to create a user model, just like so, .php. And let's do that like what we've been doing before. Let's declare strict type equal 1. Let's give it a namespace of app model, and the class is going to be user model. And we want to extend our next core component, and that's going to be our abstract base model that we need to extend into. So I'm going to say extends to our abstract base model, and you can see that it brings it in from our base directory. And the reason why this is an abstract class is because it contains one method that has to be implemented, or I want to be implemented in all of the model that extends this base model. And the class and the method actually that we're going to be implementing, that we have to implement, is a public function, and it's a guarded ID method. And the the idea behind this particular method is that we can return an array of IDs that we want to prevent certain actions from taking place on. But for the time being, or for the most part, it's probably going to be returning an empty array, which is what we're going to be doing for the time being. Just like so. Right, so with our model, there's also one important step that we always must take, and that we always have to implement a public constructor. We have to pass some data to the parent constructor of our abstract base model, which goes back to our base model. So I'm going to create public function construct, right? Now the constructor method within this user model doesn't take any arguments, but it takes, or we have to define or declare the parent construct, and that takes in 2 arguments. So I'm going to create 2 protected constant, which is going to hold those 2 arguments. So I'm going to say protected const, and it's going to be table schema, and I'm going to equal that to, let's get rid of that, users. Now that is the name of our database table, users, right? And the second one is going to be protected const table schema ID, and that is the primary key for our users table. Now these are the 2 required arguments that every model must actually define and pass to the parent construct. So I'm going to say parent construct. If I put my mouse pointer right here, you're going to see that it requires 2 arguments, and it's the table schema and a table schema ID, which you can see on your screen. So I'm going to actually, let's close this down a bit so you can see a bit more. I'm going to actually pass in those 2 protected constants to this parent construct. And all we do that is we use a self key colon and table schema and self colon table schema ID. Now these, we have to pass these 2 arguments in. That is all our user controller knows that we're dealing with the user's database through this user model. Now this is going to give us access, this user model going to give us access to that get repo method, which can then access the core repository, which is going to give us all the method like find by, find object by, etc. So we can then do what we want within our controller classes. I hope that makes sense. So if I close that back down, go back to my security controller, now we're going to try and log in again, and we're going to see what happens now. So click login, app authorized not found, obviously because I have not imported that within the class. So let's do import class. That's going to be at the very top right here. Let's go back, reload, let's try that again. App controller authorized not found. Oh, we've not saved the file, so let's save the file. Silly me. Let's save. No, that's saved. No, we should try it again and see what happens. Log in, refresh, log in. No, we're logging in successfully because now we've created that user model, and our user object or authenticator class knows exactly where to fetch the data from, right? I'm going to quickly show you the authenticator class to see what it's doing, because it's a class that contains 1 method. So I'm going to go in some of the core directory, which is located in that vendor directory, because this is being downloaded through Composer, which is going to happen if you use the MagmaSkeleton project on GitHub. So let's find a Magma core directory, look at the source, and we want to go into the auth folder, and that Authenticator class is just right here. Let's close this down so you can see a lot better. And this is what I'm referring to, the user model. So we need that user model to get the repo, find the object by email, and return the user object only if the status is active. If the user is active, then we're going to get the object back. If the user status is pending, or if the status is pending or locked or suspended, obviously we're not going to get that object back. We're going to get the object back only if that user account is active, right? And then we're returning messages if the account is not. For example, if you inputted, or if you've put in the wrong information, you're going to get an error message. Or if that object does not exist, like what we were seeing on the first attempt, we're going to get that invalid user credential message that's being returned, right? So that's a one method class. It's very simple. I'm still going to be adding bits and bobs to this actual class to deal with errors a little better, but for the time being, it's doing what we want. And the next class that we touched on is the Authorized Class. And for the time being, all we need to look at is the login method, and you can see what it's doing. It's registering a session, and we're passing in that user ID from that object, right? So we got access to the current ID within the session, and the remember me part of it is doing quite a bit, because it's going to also interact with the database. It's going to store some information within the database. It's going to store a cookie within the user browser only if we hit that remember me button, and we can specify how long we want that to run for, or when we want that cookie to be expired. But I will actually go over this in more details later on in the course, so you get a little bit of a better understanding of what it's actually doing. But again, let's go back to our security controller. Again, this is a simple, well, a login system, like not like other login system where you see we do it the old way, where we start session at the top of the page and we write out isSit function, check this, check that. Because we've done all the hard work within the core of our framework, it becomes easy to implement a login system like this. And you can see it doesn't take a lot of code to actually implement, and it's going to be secure because we're doing a lot of validation behind the scenes. We're doing a lot of like sanitization of the input field that's coming in, so we're making sure that we're protecting our actual website from attack. You see, we've got CSRF validation, checking that tokens are not, the form is not being submitted somewhere else. So we're doing quite a lot in the background, and because we've done all majority of the hard work in some of our first videos, it becomes very easy to implement something like this without actually getting messy within code. This is all it takes right here to actually log in or create a login system. Now in the next video, we're going to actually make this a little better by implementing some middleware to actually do stuff to check that if we're already logged in, then we can't get to the login page again. Because if I click on sign in, you can see that we're still showing that login page. With the middleware in our next video, we're going to prevent this action from happening, so we can't see this if we're already logged in. We're going to be implementing other middleware that's going to be doing other stuff for us as well. And you can see that we've got flash message right here, and we've got redirect. We're also going to be getting rid of that. We're going to be using event dispatches to do this for us. So we're going to make this even cleaner in our next video coming up pretty soon. So stay tuned, guys. Hope you enjoyed that one. I did. It's a very simple implementation, which got a lot of features. It's protected, and because we've done all the hard work, it was easy to implement. So stay tuned for the next video coming up pretty soon. Thanks. See you later.